Hello, friends. Tonight we rest with the Book of Ruth, a story that unfolds in the quiet corners of ancient Israel during a time when judges ruled and chaos often reigned. Yet somehow in the midst of all that uncertainty, ordinary people found ways to show extraordinary kindness. The book opens not with trumpets or declarations, but with famine, with loss, with a family making the painful decision to leave their homeland because the land itself can no longer sustain them. It's a beginning that feels heavy, almost too heavy for a story that will become one of the most beautiful in all of Scripture. But that's often how the most profound journeys begin, isn't it? In the places where everything seems to be falling apart. We meet Elimelech and Naomi, a married couple from Bethlehem in Judah, which is ironic because Bethlehem means house of bread. Yet here they are fleeing from the house of bread because there is no bread to be found. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and together this family of four makes the difficult journey eastward across the Jordan River into the land of Moab. Now Moab wasn't just any neighbouring country. It carried with it a complicated history for the Israelites. The Moabites were descendants of Lot through an incestuous relationship with his daughter after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So there was always this tension, this sense that Moab was related to Israel, but also somehow separate, not quite belonging to the covenant community. For a family from Bethlehem to relocate to Moab was more than just a geographical move. It was a spiritual and cultural crossing of boundaries, a stepping outside of what was familiar and safe into territory that carried its own risks and implications. But when you're hungry, when your children are hungry, when the land that's supposed to provide has turned dry and barren, you do what you must to survive. Elimelech and Naomi weren't abandoning their faith necessarily. They were responding to immediate need, to the growling emptiness in their stomachs, and the fear of watching their sons waste away. Sometimes faith looks like staying put and trusting God to provide, and sometimes faith looks like taking action, like moving, like making difficult choices with limited information, and hoping that somehow God's hand is still guiding, even when you can't see the path clearly ahead. The text doesn't judge them for going to Moab. It simply tells us that they went, that they settled there as resident aliens, foreigners living among foreigners, trying to build a life in a place that would never quite feel like home. And then tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies. The text offers no explanation, no details about illness or accident or age, just the stark reality that Naomi is now a widow in a foreign land with two sons to raise alone. Widowhood in the ancient world was one of the most vulnerable positions a woman could occupy. Without a husband, you lost your social standing, your economic security, your protection. You became dependent on the kindness of others or on the provision of your sons if you had any. Naomi still has her sons, so there's hope. There's still the possibility of building a future, even in the wake of this devastating loss. Mahlon and Chilion grow up, and they do what young men do. They fall in love, they marry, and interestingly, both of them marry Moabite women. One is named Orpah, and the other is named Ruth, and for about 10 years, life seems to find a rhythm. The little family of 5 makes a life together in Moab, blending cultures and traditions, building relationships across the divide that had once separated Israelite from Moabite. But then the unthinkable happens. Both sons die. Again, the text offers no explanation, no cause, no comfort, just the brutal fact that Naomi has now lost her husband and both of her sons. She's a widow and childless, which in her cultural context meant she had lost everything, every source of security, every hope for the future, every connection to her past. Her family line appears to have reached a dead end. There will be no grandchildren to carry on the name, no one to care for her in her old age, no one to inherit whatever small possessions they might have accumulated. She's alone in a foreign country, with only her 2 daughters-in-law, who themselves are now widows, young women whose futures have also been shattered by death. This is where the story really begins, in this place of absolute desolation, of triple grief, of futures cancelled and hopes extinguished. Naomi hears news from back home. Word has reached her in Moab that the Lord has come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, The famine that drove her family away has ended. Bread has returned to the house of bread. And so Naomi makes a decision. She will return home to Bethlehem. She will go back to the land of her birth, to the place where she belongs, even if that place now holds nothing but memories. She prepares for the journey, and her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, begin travelling with her, walking with her on that road that leads away from Moab and back toward Judah. But Naomi stops them. She turns to these two young women who have walked with her through unimaginable grief, and she speaks to them with remarkable clarity and love. "Go back," she tells them, "each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And then she kisses them, and they weep aloud, all three of them standing on that road between Moab and Judah, between the past and whatever uncertain future awaits. It's a moment of such tenderness, such raw emotion. You can almost hear their voices breaking, feel the weight of their embrace, sense the impossibility of the choice Naomi is asking them to make. At first, both Orpah and Ruth protest. They insist they will go back, with her to her people, but Naomi presses them. She speaks with the stark honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose. "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" She's referring to the practice of levirate marriage, where if a man died childless, his brother was obligated to marry the widow and provide an heir. But Naomi has no more sons. She's too old to remarry, and even if she could, even if she married tonight and bore sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? "No, my daughters," she says, "it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." There's such pain in those words, such theological wrestling. Naomi isn't just acknowledging practical realities, she's naming her experience of God. She feels that the Lord has turned against her, that this cascade of loss isn't random bad luck, but somehow the hand of God pressing down. It's the kind of honest, almost scandalous prayer you find in the Psalms, the kind of faith that doesn't pretend everything is fine, that doesn't paper over suffering with platitudes, but instead brings the full weight of grief and confusion directly to God. Naomi is bitter, and she doesn't hide it. She will later tell the women of Bethlehem to call her Mara, which means bitter, because the Almighty has made her life very bitter. She went away full, but the Lord has brought her back empty. And so they weep again, these three women on the road, and then Orpah makes her choice. She kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and returns to her people and her gods. The text doesn't criticize her for this. She's doing exactly what Naomi asked, what makes sense, what offers her the best chance at rebuilding her life. She's young. She can remarry among her own people. She can find security and perhaps happiness in familiar surroundings. Orpah disappears from the story at this point. We never hear of her again. But her choice is understandable, even wise from a certain perspective. She returns to what she knows, to the gods of Moab, to the possibility of starting over. But Ruth makes a different choice. Ruth clings to Naomi, and when Naomi says, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her," Ruth responds with words that have echoed through centuries, words that have been spoken at weddings and friendships, and moments of covenant commitment across thousands of years. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you," she says. "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me." It's one of the most beautiful declarations in all of Scripture, a commitment that goes beyond duty or obligation into the realm of sacrificial love. Ruth isn't just being loyal to her mother-in-law. She's choosing to leave everything familiar, her homeland, her culture, her gods, her chance at a normal future, and attach herself instead to an old, bitter, broken woman who has nothing to offer her but hardship. She's choosing Naomi's God, the God of Israel, even though from all appearances this God has brought nothing but suffering to Naomi's life. She's choosing to become part of a people who will always see her as a foreigner, a Moabite, an outsider. She's choosing a path that makes no practical sense whatsoever. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps Ruth's choice reveals something essential about covenant love, about what it means to commit yourself to someone not because of what they can give you, but simply because of who they are. Naomi has been kind to Ruth. The text tells us that earlier, Naomi showed kindness to her daughters-in-law, and Ruth is responding to that kindness with a loyalty that defies logic. She's also responding to something she's seen in Naomi's life, in Naomi's God. Even Naomi's bitterness toward God suggests a relationship, a history, a reality that Ruth wants to be part of. Sometimes we come to faith not because everything makes sense, or because we've seen miraculous provision, but because we've seen someone wrestle honestly with God. Because we've witnessed faith that doesn't collapse under the weight of suffering, but instead becomes more real, more raw, more human. When Naomi sees that Ruth is determined to go with her, she stops arguing. The text simply says she stopped urging her. And so the two of them go on together until they come to Bethlehem. And when they arrive in Bethlehem, the whole town is stirred because of them. The women of the town come out and ask, "Can this be Naomi?" There's wonder in that question, maybe even shock, because Naomi left as a wife and mother with a husband and 2 sons, and she's returning alone, except for this foreign woman beside her. She's returning empty when she left full, returning broken when she left whole, returning old when she left in her prime. And Naomi doesn't pretend otherwise. "Don't call me Naomi," she tells them. "Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has afflicted me? The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." It's such an honest moment, such a public naming of her pain. And the text just lets it sit there, doesn't rush to correct her theology or assure her that better days are coming. It simply records her bitterness, her sense that God has turned against her, her experience of emptiness and affliction. But here's what Naomi doesn't see, what she can't see in her grief. The text tells us that they arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. That's not a throwaway detail. That's the first hint of hope, the first sign that while Naomi's story feels like it's ending, actually, it's just beginning. A new chapter. Harvest time means provision, abundance, the land coming back to life after dormancy, and Ruth and Naomi are arriving just as that abundance begins to appear. They're returning to the house of bread, just as bread is being gathered. And though Naomi sees only her emptiness, the reader is invited to notice that they've returned at exactly the right time, as if perhaps God's timing is more careful than it appears, as if perhaps, even in the bitterness and loss, God is working something that hasn't yet become visible. Now Ruth, remember, is a foreigner in Bethlehem, a Moabite woman in an Israelite town, and she has no inheritance, no property, no claim on anyone's provision. But there was a law in Israel. God had commanded that when farmers harvested their fields, they were not to reap to the very edges, or go back for grain they'd missed. They were to leave the gleanings for the poor and the foreigner, for the widow and the orphan, for those who had no land of their own. It was a kind of social safety net built into the agricultural system, a way of ensuring that even the most vulnerable had access to food. Not through charity exactly, but through dignified labour. You could go into the fields during harvest and gather what had been left behind. You could work and provide for yourself, even if you owned nothing. So Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." It's a request that reveals both humility and initiative. She's not asking for a handout, she's proposing to work, but she's also aware that as a foreigner, she needs permission. She needs someone to show her favour, to allow her into their fields. Naomi simply tells her to go, "my daughter," which is the first time the bitterness seems to lift a bit, the first time Naomi speaks with something like motherly warmth, even if it's just 2 words, "Go, my daughter." And so Ruth goes out and begins to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. And the text says, "As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech." Now that phrase, "as it turned out," is doing a lot of work. It's the biblical way of describing something that appears to be coincidence, but is actually providence. Ruth doesn't know whose field this is. She's just chosen a place to work. But the narrator wants us to know that this isn't random. This is the hand of God moving quietly beneath the surface of ordinary events. Boaz happens to be a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband, which means he's connected to this family. He has a relationship to their story, even if he doesn't know yet that Naomi has returned, or that this foreign woman gleaning in his field is his relative by marriage. Boaz arrives from Bethlehem while Ruth is working, and he greets his harvesters with a blessing. "The Lord be with you." And they respond, "The Lord bless you." It's such a simple exchange, but it tells us something about the kind of man Boaz is. He's someone who invokes God's name naturally in everyday conversation, who treats his workers with respect, who creates an atmosphere of blessing rather than harsh supervision. Then Boaz notices Ruth. He asks his foreman, "Who is that young woman?" And the foreman explains, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' So she came and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." Notice what the foreman emphasizes. He identifies her first as the Moabite. That's her primary identity in this community, the foreign woman, the outsider. But he also notes her connection to Naomi and her work ethic. She's been working steadily since morning, with only a brief rest. Even before Boaz speaks to Ruth directly, he's receiving a report about her character, about her diligence and her humility. And then Boaz approaches Ruth and speaks to her with remarkable kindness. "My daughter," he says, using the same term of affection Naomi used. "Listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." There's so much care in those words. Boaz is offering her protection, provision, and belonging. He's telling his male workers not to touch her, which suggests the vulnerability she faces as a foreign woman working alone. He's inviting her to stay specifically in his fields, where she'll be safe, and he's giving her access to water that has been drawn for his workers, treating her not as an outsider, but as someone under his care. Ruth's response reveals her awareness of her status. She bows down with her face to the ground and asks him, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" She knows she has no claim on his kindness, no right to expect anything beyond the bare minimum the law requires. And yet here he is, offering her so much more. Boaz explains himself, and his explanation reveals that news travels in a small town like Bethlehem. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband," he says, "how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz has heard Ruth's story. He knows about her choice to stay with Naomi, her decision to leave Moab and come to Israel, her commitment to a woman who had nothing to offer her. And he sees in that choice something worth honouring, something that reveals character and faith. He blesses her, asking that the Lord would repay her, and he uses this beautiful image of God's wings, of Ruth having come to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel, like a small bird sheltering under its mother. Ruth responds with gratitude. "May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my Lord," she says. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." She recognises that Boaz is going beyond what's required, that he's speaking to her as if she matters, as if she's not just a nameless foreign woman, but someone worthy of attention and kindness. And Boaz continues to show her favour. When mealtime comes, he invites her to come and eat with his workers, to share in the bread and wine vinegar, and he personally offers her roasted grain, and she eats until she's satisfied and even has some left over. Then when she gets up to glean again, Boaz gives instructions to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. Those instructions transform Ruth's gleaning from desperate scavenging into something more like provision. Boaz is ensuring that she'll find plenty, that she won't have to work herself to exhaustion for a small handful of grain. He's deliberately creating abundance for her within the structure of the law. So Ruth gleans in the field until evening, and when she beats out what she has gathered, it amounts to about an ephah of barley, which is somewhere around 30 pounds of grain, an extraordinary amount for a day's gleaning, enough to feed 2 women for weeks. She carries it back to town, and her mother-in-law sees how much she has gathered. Then Ruth also brings out what she has left over from her meal and gives it to Naomi. Naomi's response suggests hope beginning to break through the bitterness. "Where did you glean today?" she asks. "Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And when Ruth tells her that the man's name is Boaz, Naomi's whole demeanour shifts. "The Lord bless him," she says. "The Lord has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead." For the first time since we met Naomi, she's speaking of the Lord not as the one who has afflicted her, but as the one who shows kindness. Not as the one whose hand has turned against her, but as the one who blesses. Something in learning that Ruth worked in Boaz's field has awakened hope in Naomi's heart. And then she explains why. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Now this term, guardian redeemer, or kinsman redeemer in some translations, is crucial to understanding where the story is going. In Israelite law and custom, there was this beautiful provision that if a family fell on hard times, if they lost their land, or fell into debt, or were left without an heir, a close relative had both the right and the responsibility to step in and redeem the situation, to buy back the land, to pay off the debt, to ensure that the family line continued and the inheritance remained within the clan. It was a way of protecting the vulnerable, of keeping families intact, of making sure that tragedy didn't result in permanent loss. The guardian redeemer was someone who had the means and the family connection to restore what had been lost. And Boaz, Naomi is now realizing, is that person for their family. Ruth tells Naomi something else Boaz said, that she should stay close to his workers until all the harvest is finished, and Naomi affirms that advice. "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him," she says, "because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stays close to the women who work for Boaz, gleaning through both the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, living all the while with her mother-in-law. And you can sense the passage of time here, weeks going by, the rhythm of harvest days, Ruth going out each morning and returning each evening with grain, Naomi seeing her daughter-in-law work faithfully, provision arriving day after day, not through dramatic intervention, but through steady labour and quiet kindness, through the ordinary structures of community and law and human decency. But Naomi is thinking ahead now. She's moved from bitterness to strategy, from grief to hope, from resignation to possibility. One day she says to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be well provided for? Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and dress in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." Now this is where the story takes a turn that might make modern readers a bit uncomfortable. Naomi is essentially telling Ruth to approach Boaz at night in a way that carries clear romantic and perhaps even sexual overtones. Washing, perfuming herself, dressing in her best clothes. These are not the preparations of someone going to make a business proposal. And then lying at his feet after he's eaten and drunk. It's intimate, vulnerable, potentially scandalous. The threshing floor was a liminal space, literally located at the edge of town, a place where normal social rules were somewhat suspended, where celebration and harvest and male camaraderie mixed, where the boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate could blur. For Ruth to go there alone at night and approach a man who has been drinking, this is risky in multiple ways. It could be misunderstood, it could damage her reputation, it could even be dangerous. But Naomi is trusting Boaz's character. She's trusting what she's seen in how he's treated Ruth. And she's also working within the customs of her time. There was apparently some understanding that a woman could propose marriage to a guardian redeemer by presenting herself in this vulnerable way, by essentially saying, "I am placing myself under your protection. I am asking you to cover me." Ruth's response to these instructions is simple and complete. "I will do whatever you say." She trusts Naomi. She trusts Naomi's judgment about Boaz, and she's willing to take this risk. So Ruth goes down to the threshing floor and does everything her mother-in-law tells her to do. She watches from the shadows as Boaz eats and drinks, and the text tells us his heart is merry, which suggests celebration, perhaps relief that the harvest has gone well, perhaps contentment in the work completed and the abundance secured. When he finishes eating and drinking, Boaz goes to lie down at the far end of the grain pile, and Ruth approaches quietly, uncovers his feet, and lies down. The moment is charged with possibility and risk, with Ruth making herself utterly vulnerable, placing herself literally at the feet of this man who has shown her kindness, but who could reject her, who could misunderstand her intentions, who could respond in ways that would leave her shamed and hopeless. In the middle of the night, something startles Boaz. He turns and discovers a woman lying at his feet, and he asks, with understandable confusion, "Who are you?" Ruth's answer is direct and remarkable. "I am your servant Ruth," she says. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." That phrase, "spread the corner of your garment over me," is deeply symbolic. It's a way of asking for protection, for covering, for marriage. The corner, or wing of the garment, echoes Boaz's own earlier blessing, when he prayed that the Lord would reward Ruth for coming to take refuge under his wings. And now she's asking Boaz himself to be that covering, to be the human instrument of God's protection and provision. She's also invoking his role as guardian redeemer. She's not just proposing marriage based on attraction or compatibility. She's appealing to his family obligation, his responsibility to help restore what has been lost. Boaz's response reveals the kind of man he is. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he says. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." He sees Ruth's proposal not as forward or inappropriate, but as an act of kindness, and even more, as a greater kindness than her original loyalty to Naomi, because by coming to him instead of seeking a younger man, she's honouring the family obligation. She's prioritising the need to preserve Elimelech's line over her own preferences or desires. Boaz is aware that he's older, that Ruth could have her pick of younger men, and he's moved that she would choose him, that she would see in him not just wealth or security, but the possibility of redemption for Naomi's family. "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid," Boaz continues. "I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." This is extraordinary. Boaz is telling Ruth that her reputation in Bethlehem has been established, that despite being a foreigner, despite being a Moabite, she has become known as a woman of valour, of worth, of noble character. The Hebrew word used here is the same word used to describe the ideal wife in Proverbs 31, a woman of valour, and it's also the same word used to describe Boaz himself, just chapters earlier, when he was introduced as a man of standing, literally, a mighty man of valour. They're being presented as equals, two people of noble character finding each other, two people worthy of respect and honour, recognising that same quality in one another. But then Boaz adds something that complicates the situation. "Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family," he says, "there is another who is more closely related than I." The excitement of the moment suddenly shifts into uncertainty. There's someone else, someone with a closer family connection, and therefore a prior claim to the role of redeemer, someone who has the first right to marry Ruth and redeem Naomi's family property. Boaz could simply ignore this other relative, could take what Ruth is offering without regard for the proper order, but that's not who he is. He's a man who operates within the structures of law and custom, who does things the right way, even when it might cost him something he desires. "Stay here for the night," Boaz tells Ruth, "and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So Ruth lies at his feet until morning, but she gets up before anyone could be recognized. Because Boaz is careful of her reputation. He doesn't want anyone to know that a woman came to the threshing floor, doesn't want Ruth's honor to be compromised by gossip or misunderstanding. Before she leaves, Boaz tells her to bring him the shawl she's wearing and to hold it out. And when she does, he pours into it 6 measures of barley and places the bundle on her. Then he goes back to town. That gift of grain is significant. It's provision, certainly, something substantial for Ruth to bring home to Naomi. But it's also a promise, a sign of Boaz's intentions, a demonstration that he's serious about his commitment to care for them. When Ruth returns to Naomi, her mother-in-law asks, "How did it go, my daughter?" And Ruth tells her everything Boaz did for her and shows her the 6 measures of barley, explaining that Boaz said, "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed." There's that word again, empty. The same word Naomi used when she returned to Bethlehem and told the women to call her Mara because she came back empty. And now Boaz, through Ruth, is filling that emptiness, is ensuring that Naomi isn't empty anymore, that provision and hope are returning to her life. Naomi's response suggests both hope and wisdom. "Wait, my daughter," she tells Ruth, "until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Naomi understands Boaz's character. She knows that he won't delay, that he'll move quickly to resolve the question of redemption, and she trusts that by the end of this day, they'll know whether their future lies with Boaz or with this other, closer relative. So they wait, and we, as readers, wait with them, the story pausing at this moment of suspense where everything hangs in the balance. Meanwhile, Boaz goes up to the town gate and sits there, which wasn't a casual choice. The town gate was where business was conducted, where legal matters were settled, where the elders gathered to witness transactions and resolve disputes. It was the public square, the courthouse, the place where official community business happened. Boaz sits and waits, and soon enough the guardian redeemer he mentioned comes along, and Boaz calls to him, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." And the man sits down. The text doesn't give us this relative's name. He's just called so-and-so, which is almost comical. It's as if the narrator is saying, this man isn't even worth naming. He's going to miss his opportunity and fade into obscurity, so why bother remembering who he was? Boaz then gathers 10 of the elders of the town and asks them to sit as witnesses, establishing that whatever transaction is about to occur will be legally binding and publicly acknowledged. And then Boaz addresses the relative, explaining the situation. Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me so, I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. Now this is the first we're hearing about land. Up until now, the focus has been on Ruth's gleaning, on their poverty and need. But apparently Naomi does have some claim to family land, perhaps land that Elimelech owned before they left for Moab. And she's in a position to sell it, possibly because she has no sons to inherit it, possibly because she needs the money to survive. By the laws of the time, family land was supposed to stay within the family, so before it could be sold to an outsider, relatives had the right and responsibility to purchase it themselves, to keep it in the clan. This closer relative would be first in line for that right, and if he declines, then Boaz would be next. The relative's initial response is eager. "I will redeem it," he says, presumably seeing this as a good business opportunity, a chance to add to his property holdings at a reasonable price. But then Boaz adds the complication, the piece of information that changes everything. On the day you buy the land from Naomi, he says, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. This is crucial. Redeeming the land isn't just about buying property. It comes with the obligation to marry Ruth, and any son born from that marriage would be considered the heir of Mahlon, Ruth's dead husband, not the heir of the man who married her. The land would ultimately pass to that child, who would carry on Elimelech's family line, not the Redeemer's own line. Suddenly the relative's enthusiasm evaporates. At this, the guardian Redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it." His concern seems to be economic. If he buys the land and marries Ruth and she bears a son, that son would inherit the land he just purchased. So he'd be spending his own money to buy property that would ultimately go to someone else's heir, effectively diminishing his own children's inheritance. What looks like a good deal when it's just property becomes a bad deal when it includes the obligation to raise up an heir for a dead relative. So he backs out. He declines his right as Redeemer, and in doing so, he removes the obstacle standing between Boaz and Ruth. The text tells us that in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel, and so the guardian Redeemer says to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removes his sandal. It's a symbolic gesture, a way of saying, "I'm stepping out of this, I'm walking away from this right and responsibility, you take it." And Boaz accepts. He announces to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Notice the language Boaz uses. He doesn't just say, "I'm marrying Ruth." He says, "I have acquired Ruth as my wife," using the same term for acquiring property. Not because he sees her as property, but because this is the legal language of redemption. He's fulfilling the role of guardian redeemer, which involves both land and marriage, both property and person, both economic transaction and covenantal relationship. And he's explicit about his purpose. He's doing this to maintain the name of the dead, to ensure that Mahlon and Elimelech's family line doesn't vanish, that their inheritance remains connected to their name, that even in death they're not forgotten or erased from the community. The elders and all the people at the gate respond as witnesses, affirming the transaction and speaking a blessing over Boaz and Ruth. "We are witnesses," they say. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." It's a remarkable blessing, invoking the matriarchs Rachel and Leah, who were the mothers of the 12 tribes, comparing Ruth to them, a Moabite woman being compared to the founding mothers of Israel, being welcomed not as an outsider, but as someone who will build up the family of Israel, just as they did. And then there's that reference to Perez and Tamar, which might seem like an odd comparison until you remember that story from Genesis. Tamar was a widow, whose father-in-law, Judah, refused to give her his youngest son in marriage as the law required. So she disguised herself as a prostitute, slept with Judah himself, became pregnant, and gave birth to Perez, who became an ancestor of Boaz. It's a scandalous story involving deception and unconventional sexuality. But Tamar was ultimately vindicated because she was acting to preserve her dead husband's line, and Perez, her son, became part of the messianic lineage. By invoking this story, the elders are acknowledging that Ruth's situation has echoes of Tamar's, both women acting with initiative and courage to secure offspring for a dead relative. Both women operating outside normal boundaries, but within the spirit of the law. Both women ultimately honoured for their actions, rather than condemned. So Boaz takes Ruth, and she becomes his wife, and he makes love to her, and the Lord enables her to conceive, and she gives birth to a son. The text is remarkably straightforward about this. Boaz marries Ruth, they consummate the marriage, conception happens, a child is born, and running through it all is the acknowledgement that the Lord enables conception, that this isn't just biology, but divine gift, that God is actively at work in bringing this child into the world. And when the women of Bethlehem hear about the birth, they say to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." That blessing from the women is full of significance. They're praising God for not leaving Naomi without a redeemer. And while they're probably referring to the baby, the word could also apply to Boaz. God has provided a redeemer for this family, in both the man who married Ruth and the child born from that marriage. They're promising that this child will renew Naomi's life, will give her purpose and hope again after all the years of bitterness and loss. And they're honouring Ruth with extraordinary praise, calling her better than 7 sons. 7 being the number of completeness and perfection. They're saying that Ruth's love and loyalty to Naomi is worth more than the most ideal family situation an Israelite woman could hope for. That this foreign woman has proven herself to be worth more than any biological child could be. Then Naomi takes the child in her arms and cares for him, and the women say she has a son, as if Naomi herself had given birth, as if this baby born to Ruth belongs equally to the mother-in-law who has been empty and is now full again. They name him Obed, which means servant or worshipper, a name that acknowledges service to God, and perhaps also the child's role in serving the family line, in continuing what had nearly ended. And then the text adds a genealogy that opens up the story to show us its larger significance. Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. Suddenly we realise we haven't just been reading a small domestic drama about 2 widows and a kind landowner. We've been reading the origin story of Israel's greatest king, the man after God's own heart, King David, who will unite the tribes and establish Jerusalem, and be promised that his descendants will rule forever. Ruth the Moabite, the outsider, the foreigner, the woman who had no place in Israel's covenant community, she becomes the great-grandmother of David. She enters the royal lineage. Her name is forever connected to the messianic line. And when we get to the New Testament, when Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus, Ruth is there, one of only 4 women mentioned in that male-dominated lineage, honoured and remembered as essential to the story of redemption. The book ends with that genealogy, tracing the line from Perez through several generations to Boaz, then to Obed, then to Jesse, then to David, showing us that this little story, set in the time of the Judges, this tale of grain fields and threshing floors and family obligations, is actually part of the grand sweep of salvation history. Everything that seems small and ordinary, a widow gleaning in a field, a landowner showing kindness, a risky nighttime proposal, a baby born to continue a family name, all of it was part of God's larger plan. All of it was moving toward the establishment of the Davidic line, and ultimately toward the birth of the Messiah. But before we zoom out too far, before we lose ourselves in the theological implications and the messianic significance, let's sit with the human story for a moment longer, because that's really what the Book of Ruth is, a deeply human story about loss and loyalty, about taking risks and showing kindness, about ordinary people making faithful choices in difficult circumstances. It's a story where God's name is invoked constantly, but God never speaks directly, never appears in dramatic fashion, never parts any seas or sends any angels. God works through famine ending and harvest beginning, through Ruth deciding to stay with Naomi, through Boaz noticing a foreign woman in his field, through the other relative declining to redeem, through conception happening and a baby being born. God works through the ordinary, through the everyday choices of people trying to do right by each other, through the structures of community and law and family obligation. Naomi's bitterness was real. Her sense that God had turned against her was genuine, and the text doesn't rebuke her for it, doesn't tell her she's wrong to feel abandoned and afflicted. Sometimes life brings losses that feel like divine punishment, even when they're not. Sometimes the world breaks us in ways that make it hard to see any purpose or plan. Naomi had every reason to believe her story was over, that she would die alone and forgotten, with her family line extinguished. But what she couldn't see in her grief was that the end of one chapter was actually the beginning of another, that the young Moabite woman walking beside her on the road from Moab to Bethlehem was carrying the seeds of restoration, that loyalty and kindness were about to intersect with providence in ways no one could have predicted. Ruth's choice to stay with Naomi was remarkable, not because it was religiously motivated in any obvious way. She didn't have a dramatic conversion experience, didn't see a vision or hear a voice. She just decided to attach herself to this bitter old woman and the God this woman served, even though that God seemed to have brought nothing but suffering. Ruth chose relationship over security, commitment over comfort, and in making that choice, she stepped into a story much larger than she could have imagined. She went from being a Moabite woman with no future to being a mother in Israel, from being an outsider to being an ancestor of kings, and all because she was faithful in small things, because she worked hard in the fields, because she trusted Naomi's wisdom, because she was willing to take a risk at the threshing floor. And Boaz, he didn't have to show Ruth special kindness. The law required that he allow gleaning, but it didn't require that he speak to her personally, offer her water, invite her to share meals, instruct his workers to leave extra grain for her. He went beyond what was required because he recognized something in Ruth. He saw her loyalty and her character, and he honored it. When the opportunity came to redeem her and Naomi, he could have let it go, could have said, "Well, there's someone ahead of me in line, so it's not my problem." But instead, he made sure the matter was resolved. He sat at the gate until the other relative came by. He laid out the situation clearly, and when that relative declined, he stepped up without hesitation. Boaz was a man of means and standing, who used his resources to protect and provide for vulnerable women, who operated with integrity and honor, who saw redemption not as burden, but as privilege. These three people, Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, they each had to make choices, to trust when trust was hard, to hope when hope seemed foolish, to act when action required courage. And the Book of Ruth tells us that those small human choices matter, that faithfulness in ordinary circumstances opens space for God to work, that kindness and loyalty and integrity aren't just nice qualities, but the very stuff through which divine purposes unfold. The story doesn't explain why Elimelech and his sons died, doesn't justify the suffering Naomi endured, doesn't make the pain less painful, but it does show that suffering isn't the end of the story, that what seems like tragedy can become the ground in which new life grows. There's something profoundly comforting in how understated the book is, how it refuses to over-dramatize or over-spiritualize the events, how it lets the story speak through its details and its silences. When Ruth goes out to glean, we're not told that God led her to Boaz's field. We're told it happened that way, as it turned out. A phrase that acknowledges both human choice and divine providence without needing to explain exactly how they work together. When Boaz shows her kindness, we're not told he received a prophetic word. We're told he noticed her and asked about her and responded with generosity. Ordinary human decency elevated into something redemptive. When Ruth approaches him at the threshing floor, we're not told angels orchestrated the moment. We're told Naomi came up with a plan, and Ruth trusted her and took a risk. Human initiative meeting human receptivity in the darkness. The God of the Book of Ruth is a God who works through the ordinary, who meets people in their everyday lives and invites them to participate in something larger through their simple faithfulness, who transforms loss into legacy, not by erasing the suffering, but by bringing new life out of it. Naomi's sons are still dead. That tragedy isn't undone. But through Ruth and Boaz, a new generation is born. The family line continues, and Naomi, who returned empty, finds her arms full again. Ruth remains a Moabite. That identity doesn't disappear, but it's no longer a barrier. Instead, it becomes part of what makes her story so remarkable. Proof that God's purposes include the outsider, the foreigner, the one who wasn't supposed to be part of the covenant community. And that's perhaps the most radical element of this little book, tucked between Judges and 1 Samuel. It insists that ethnicity and birth don't determine who belongs to God's people, that a Moabite woman can be more faithful than many Israelites, that covenant loyalty isn't about bloodline, but about choice and commitment, that the line of David and ultimately of Jesus includes not just proper Jews, but a woman from a nation that was supposed to be Israel's enemy. Ruth becomes a living argument against exclusion, against the idea that some people are too foreign, too other, too outside to be included in God's redemptive work. Her story testifies that the boundary between insider and outsider is more permeable than religious gatekeepers would like, that God has always been in the business of grafting in the unexpected, of building kingdoms through the unlikely. If we're reading Ruth in the broader canonical context, we can't help but notice how it subverts the violence and chaos of the Book of Judges that comes before it. In Judges, everyone does what is right in their own eyes, and the result is civil war, gang rape, idolatry, and fragmentation. But in Ruth, people do what is right according to the law and custom, and the result is restoration, provision, and the establishment of the Davidic line. It's as if the book is saying, look, this is what it looks like when people live with kindness and integrity, when they honour their obligations and show mercy to the vulnerable, when they create space for the foreign woman and the destitute widow. This is what community is supposed to be, and from this kind of faithfulness, kings are born. The Book of Ruth also gives us one of the most beautiful portraits of Hesed in all of Scripture, that rich Hebrew word often translated as loving kindness or steadfast love or mercy, but really encompassing all of those and more. A kind of covenant loyalty that goes beyond what's required, that acts with generosity and faithfulness, even when it's costly. Ruth shows Hesed to Naomi by refusing to abandon her, by leaving her own country and people to care for a bitter old woman who has nothing to offer. Boaz shows Hesed to Ruth by protecting her and providing for her beyond what the law requires, by choosing to redeem when he could have let someone else handle it. And the text tells us God shows Hesed to both the living and the dead, working through these human acts of kindness to preserve family lines and restore what was lost. Hesed is the thread that runs through the whole story, binding these characters together and binding them to the God who models this kind of love and calls his people to embody it. When we think about Ruth's place in salvation history, when we remember that she's David's great-grandmother and therefore an ancestor of Jesus, we're invited to see how God has always worked through unlikely people in unexpected ways. The genealogy of Jesus in Matthew includes 4 women before Mary, and each of them has a story that's complicated, even scandalous by conventional standards. There's Tamar, who disguised herself as a prostitute to get pregnant by her father-in-law. There's Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, who hid Israelite spies in Jericho. There's Ruth, the Moabite widow, who approached Boaz at night on the threshing floor. And there's Bathsheba, who committed adultery with David and became Solomon's mother. These are not the pristine matriarchs you'd expect in a messianic genealogy. They're women with messy stories, foreign women, women who operated outside proper boundaries, women who took risks and made choices that could have destroyed them, but instead became vehicles of redemption. The inclusion of Ruth in Jesus' family tree tells us something essential about who Jesus came for and how God's kingdom works. It's not built on purity of bloodline or religious correctness, but on grace that reaches into the margins, that welcomes the outsider, that redeems the unlikely, and makes them central to the story. Jesus himself would later be criticized for associating with tax collectors and sinners, for touching lepers and speaking with Samaritan women, for including people who had no business being included. but he was simply continuing what God had been doing all along. What we see clearly in Ruth's story: choosing the foreigner, elevating the humble, working through those the religious establishment had written off. There's also something powerful in how the Book of Ruth centers women's stories and women's agency in a patriarchal culture. Yes, there are men in the story, important men, Boaz and the unnamed closer relative, and the male elders at the gate. But the emotional core of the narrative belongs to Naomi and Ruth. Their relationship drives the plot. Their choices shape the outcome. Their suffering and restoration form the heart of the story. Naomi moves from bitterness to blessing, from emptiness to fullness, from death to life. And it happens not because a man rescues her, but because a woman stays faithful to her. Because Ruth refuses to let her die alone and forgotten. Because female solidarity creates space for male kindness to enter. Ruth herself is remarkable in how she's portrayed. She's not passive or helpless, waiting for a man to notice her and solve her problems. She's active, taking initiative, making proposals, working in the fields, approaching Boaz at night, speaking with clarity about what she needs and what she's asking for. She's vulnerable, yes. Dependent on others' kindness, yes. But within those constraints, she exercises agency. She makes choices that shape her destiny. And the text honours that, presents her as a woman of valour whose character commands respect. When Boaz blesses her and the townspeople compare her to Rachel and Leah, when the women of Bethlehem declare her better than 7 sons, they're recognising that Ruth's faithfulness and courage have made her worthy of being remembered alongside the great matriarchs of Israel. And Naomi, for all her bitterness, is also a woman who acts rather than merely endures. She decides to return to Bethlehem. She counsels Ruth on how to approach Boaz. She understands the laws of redemption and works within them to secure their future. Her bitterness doesn't make her passive, doesn't cause her to give up. Instead, it seems to fuel a kind of fierce determination to survive, to find a way forward even when the path is unclear. When she tells the women to call her Mara, bitter, she's not wallowing in self-pity. She's naming her reality, claiming her experience, refusing to pretend that everything is fine when her life has been shattered. And that honesty, that willingness to bring her full self, including her bitterness, before God and community, creates space for healing to begin. The contrast between how Naomi speaks about God at the beginning and end of the story is striking. At first she says the Lord's hand has turned against her. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon her. She's afflicted and empty, and God is the one who did it. But by the end, when the women bless her and she holds baby Obed in her arms, she's silent. The text doesn't record any words from her, but her silence feels different now, feels like contentment, like peace. Like maybe she's learning that God's hand was never actually against her, even when it felt that way. That sometimes what looks like divine abandonment is actually the dark space before dawn, the necessary emptiness before filling, the winter before spring. The book never explicitly tells Naomi she was wrong to be bitter, never rebukes her theology or corrects her understanding. It simply shows her that life isn't finished, that new chapters can open when you thought the book was closed, that God can work restoration even through tragedy without pretending the tragedy wasn't real or didn't matter. Naomi's sons are still dead. Elimelech is still gone. Those losses are permanent. But the story doesn't end with loss. It moves through loss towards something new, toward Ruth and Boaz and baby Obed, toward a family reconstituted in a different form, toward hope that doesn't erase grief but exists alongside it, intertwined with it. When we sit with the Book of Ruth as modern readers, especially those of us far removed from ancient Israelite culture and agrarian life and levirate marriage customs, it's easy to focus on the strangeness, on how different their world was from ours. But the emotional truths of the story remain remarkably accessible. We know what it's like to lose people we love, to feel that life has turned against us, to wonder if there's any hope left when everything familiar has been stripped away. We know what it's like to be strangers in unfamiliar places, to depend on others' kindness, to try to belong when we're not sure we're welcome. We know what it's like to take risks, to trust when trust is frightening, to make commitments that might cost us everything. We know the relief of being noticed, of having someone powerful use their power to protect rather than exploit, of receiving mercy we didn't earn and couldn't demand. And we know, or we long to know, what it's like to be part of a community where people look out for each other, where the vulnerable are protected rather than preyed upon, where obligations to family and neighbour are honoured rather than shirked, where ordinary kindness creates space for extraordinary redemption. The Book of Ruth paints a picture of what human society can look like when people embody Hesed, when they choose loyalty over convenience, when they see the foreigner and the widow not as problems to be managed, but as people to be honoured, when they use whatever power and resources they have to lift others up rather than secure their own position. Boaz could have ignored Ruth, could have sent his foreman to deal with her if she became a problem, could have taken advantage of her vulnerability, could have married her without going through the proper legal channels to deal with the closer relative. But at every turn, he chooses the path of integrity and generosity. He goes beyond what's required, not because he has to, but because he can, because he's the kind of person who sees need and responds, who recognizes character and honors it, who understands that his resources and position exist not just for his own benefit, but for the good of his community. He's presented as the ideal of what it means to be a person of means and influence, using both to create flourishing rather than hoarding them for security. The book also invites us to think about divine providence and human responsibility, about how God's sovereignty and human agency work together rather than against each other. Ruth didn't know when she went out to glean that morning that she would end up in Boaz's field. It happened that way, the text says, with that wonderful ambiguity that allows for both coincidence and providence. Was it random chance? Or was God directing her steps? And does that question even need to be answered? Maybe the point is that God works through what looks like chance, through the ordinary decisions people make when they're just trying to survive another day, through Ruth choosing one field over another and happening to choose the one where her family's kinsman redeemer was overseeing the harvest. And Boaz didn't know when he showed kindness to a foreign woman gleaning in his field that he was participating in God's plan to establish the Davidic line. He was just being decent, just treating someone with dignity, just offering protection and provision because that's who he was. And yet his ordinary goodness became part of the extraordinary story of redemption. This is how God often works, not through dramatic interventions that override human choice, but through the accumulation of small acts of faithfulness, through people making good decisions in their particular contexts, through kindness meeting need, through loyalty persisting through difficulty, through ordinary life becoming the arena where divine purposes unfold. The book refuses to pull back the curtain and show us God manipulating events or compelling choices. Instead, it trusts that when people live with integrity and compassion, when they honour their obligations and extend mercy to the vulnerable, when they make room for the stranger and care for the widow, God's purposes are served, even if no one realises it at the time. It's a vision of providence that takes human agency seriously, that doesn't reduce people to puppets on divine strings, but instead invites them to be co-creators with God, participants in redemption through their faithful choices. This has implications for how we think about our own lives, about whether our ordinary decisions and daily interactions matter in any larger sense. The Book of Ruth suggests they do, that how we treat the person in front of us, whether we show kindness or indifference, whether we extend ourselves or protect our own interests, whether we include or exclude, these choices ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control. Ruth had no idea that staying with Naomi would lead to her becoming David's great-grandmother. She just knew she loved this woman and couldn't leave her. Boaz had no idea that marrying Ruth would connect him to the messianic line. He just knew this was a woman of valour who deserved to be honoured and protected. But their small choices, their faithful decisions in their particular moments, became part of the grand story of salvation. So maybe the book is inviting us to faithfulness in small things, to kindness in ordinary moments, to treating the people we encounter with dignity and generosity, not because we can see how it fits into some cosmic plan, but simply because it's right. Because Hesed, covenant loyalty, and loving kindness is how God's people are meant to live in the world. And maybe as we do that, as we show up for each other, as we make space for the outsider and care for the vulnerable, as we use whatever resources we have to bless rather than hoard, we're participating in redemption. We're creating conditions where new life can emerge from loss, where emptiness can be filled, where God's purposes can unfold through human faithfulness. The Book of Ruth is also remarkably restrained in its storytelling. It doesn't explain motivations in great detail, doesn't get inside characters' heads and tell us what they're thinking and feeling. Instead, it shows us what they do and lets their actions reveal their character. We're not told why Ruth decides to stay with Naomi. We just hear her beautiful speech of commitment. We're not told what Boaz is thinking when he first sees Ruth in his field. We just watch him treat her with extraordinary kindness. We're not told how Naomi feels when she holds baby Obed. We just see the women of Bethlehem rejoicing and declaring that she has a son. This restraint invites us into the story, asks us to imagine and interpret, to fill in the emotional spaces with our own experience of love and loss and hope. And the ending, that genealogy that traces the line from Perez to David, it opens the story outward, shows us that what seemed like a small family drama in an insignificant town during a chaotic period of Israel's history was actually foundational, essential, part of the trajectory that leads to Israel's greatest king and eventually to the Messiah himself. But the genealogy doesn't overwhelm the human story, doesn't make Ruth and Naomi and Boaz merely instruments of divine purpose. Instead, it honours their particular lives and choices, while also locating them within a larger narrative. It says both that their story matters in itself, for its own sake, for what it is, reveals about faithfulness and kindness and redemption in human life, and that it matters beyond itself, that it connects to purposes larger than anyone involved could have imagined. This tension between the particular and the universal, between the intimate human story and the grand salvation history, is part of what makes the book so compelling. We can read it as a beautiful tale about loyalty and love, about a widow and her daughter-in-law making a life together, about a kind man who does right by vulnerable women, about a baby born to bring joy to a grieving grandmother. And that reading is complete and satisfying in itself. But we can also read it as part of the larger story of how God works in history, how the line of David was established, how foreigners were included in Israel's covenant community, how Jesus' genealogy includes the unexpected and the unlikely, and that reading enriches rather than replaces the human dimension. The book seems to be saying that these two levels aren't separate, that God's grand purposes are worked out precisely through particular human lives, through specific choices in concrete circumstances, through the texture of daily existence, with all its loss and hope and ordinary struggling to do right. Salvation history doesn't happen in some abstract spiritual realm disconnected from the mundane. It happens in grain fields and at town gates, in night conversations between a widow and her daughter-in-law, in business transactions witnessed by elders, in the labour of childbirth and the joy of holding a newborn, in all the small and large moments that make up a human life. When we remember that Ruth is read in Jewish tradition during the festival of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, celebrating both the spring harvest and the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, we see additional layers of meaning. The harvest setting of the story connects to the agricultural dimension of the festival, Ruth gleaning in the barley and wheat harvests, Boaz winnowing on the threshing floor, the abundance of grain representing God's provision and the land's fruitfulness. But the connection to Torah is equally significant. Ruth choosing to place herself under the God of Israel, accepting his law, and becoming part of his covenant people, echoes Israel's own acceptance of Torah at Sinai, and her declaration, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God, becomes a kind of personal Sinai moment, a choosing of covenant relationship. Reading Ruth at Shavuot also emphasizes the themes of conversion and inclusion. Ruth the Moabite, who becomes Ruth the Israelite, who is welcomed into the community and honored as a woman of valor, who proves that relationship with God isn't limited by ethnicity or birth, but is open to anyone who chooses it. In the rabbinic tradition, Ruth becomes the model proselyte, the convert who embraces Judaism not for gain, but out of genuine commitment, who attaches herself to the Jewish people even when it costs her everything, and her reward is to become the ancestor of David and the Messiah, demonstrating that converts are not second-class members of the covenant community, but can stand at its very centre. The book also speaks to questions about intermarriage and ethnic boundaries that were contested in ancient Israel and remain challenging in various ways today. On one hand, Israelite law prohibited marriage with certain foreign nations, including Moab, meant to prevent religious syncretism and the worship of foreign gods. But on the other hand, here is Ruth, a Moabite, not only marrying into Israel, but being celebrated as righteous and honoured in the genealogy of David. How do we reconcile these tensions? The answer seems to be that Ruth's conversion, her choice to worship the God of Israel and attach herself to Naomi and the covenant community, transforms her identity. She's still ethnically Moabite. The text keeps calling her Ruth, the Moabite, even after she's married to Boaz. But she's no longer religiously or spiritually Moabite. She's chosen Israel's God, and therefore becomes part of Israel herself. This suggests that the biblical concern with ethnic boundaries was never really about race or blood purity, but about religious fidelity, about not allowing foreign gods and foreign worship practices to infiltrate and corrupt Israel's exclusive devotion to Yahweh. When foreigners like Ruth chose to worship Israel's God, when they placed themselves under the covenant and committed to its obligations, they were welcomed, included, honoured. The boundary that mattered was theological, not ethnic. And the Book of Ruth demonstrates this by showing how a Moabite woman becomes more faithful than many native Israelites, how her loyalty and kindness embody the very values that the covenant was meant to produce in God's people. In the New Testament, this same principle expands further. The dividing wall between Jew and Gentile is broken down in Christ, Paul will write, and all who are in Christ are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise, regardless of their ethnic background. Ruth's story anticipates this, shows that God's covenant was never meant to be exclusive in an ethnic sense, but was always designed to eventually include all nations, all peoples, anyone who would come under the wings of Israel's God seeking refuge. Jesus himself, descended from Ruth, demonstrates that the Messiah's lineage includes the nations, that redemption was always meant to flow outward from Israel to encompass the whole world. There's also something here about how the vulnerable are often the ones who display the greatest faith, the greatest loyalty, the greatest courage. Ruth has nothing, no security, no status, no claim on anyone's help, and yet she's the one who shows hesed, who commits herself utterly, who takes risks, who works hard, who trusts. Naomi is bitter and empty and has every reason to give up, yet she's the one who returns home, who finds hope again, who counsels Ruth wisely. These aren't powerful people. They're not the heroes of conventional stories. They're widows and foreigners, people on the margins, and yet through them, God works redemption. Through their faithfulness in small things, through their ordinary choices to be kind and loyal and decent, the line of David is established, and the messianic promise is preserved. This pattern appears throughout Scripture, God choosing the younger over the elder, the weak over the strong, the unlikely over the obvious. Not because weakness is virtuous in itself, but because it creates space for divine power to be revealed, because it reminds us that redemption comes from God, not from human strength or status. Ruth and Naomi have no power to save themselves. They're completely dependent on the kindness of others and the providence of God. And that very dependence becomes the condition for their redemption. It forces them to trust, to take risks, to rely on hesed rather than entitlement. And in that posture of vulnerability, they encounter both human kindness in Boaz and divine faithfulness in the God who doesn't leave them without a redeemer. For those of us who have experienced loss, who know what it feels like to have your future cancelled, your plans disrupted, your loved ones taken away, the Book of Ruth offers a particular kind of comfort. It doesn't minimize the pain, doesn't suggest that loss isn't real or that grief is inappropriate. Naomi's bitterness is recorded without condemnation. Her sense that God has afflicted her is acknowledged as her genuine experience. The book doesn't rush to tie everything up with a neat theological bow, doesn't explain why Elimelech and his sons had to die, doesn't offer platitudes about everything happening for a reason. Instead, it simply shows that life continues after loss, that new possibilities can emerge from devastation, that what feels like an ending can become a beginning, even though the losses remain losses, even though those who died are still gone. This is a more honest kind of hope than the false promise that everything will be restored exactly as it was. Naomi doesn't get Elimelech back. She doesn't get her sons back. Those relationships are severed permanently. But she does get a daughter-in-law whose love is better than 7 sons. She does get a grandson to hold. She does get to see her family line continue when she thought it had ended. The new life doesn't erase the old losses, but it does make continued living possible. It gives her a reason to go on, a future to move toward, a sense that her story isn't finished, even though it will always carry the scars of what she endured. And for Ruth, the story offers hope of a different kind. Hope that choosing loyalty over security, that committing yourself to someone even when it costs you everything, that taking risks for love rather than playing it safe for comfort, these choices can lead to blessing, even though there are no guarantees. Ruth didn't stay with Naomi because she knew it would work out. She stayed because she couldn't do otherwise, because her commitment was deeper than calculation, because love sometimes demands that we step into uncertainty, with only our loyalty to guide us. And the fact that it worked out, that she found Boaz, that she bore a son, that she became part of the royal lineage, none of that was foreordained or inevitable. It emerged from the interplay of her faithfulness and others' kindness and circumstances aligning in ways no one could have predicted. The book invites us to make those same kinds of commitments, to choose loyalty over self-protection, to show kindness even when we can't see how it will benefit us, to include the outsider and care for the vulnerable, not because we expect to be rewarded, but because this is what it means to live in covenant community, to embody hesed, to reflect the character of the God who doesn't abandon us even when we feel abandoned, who works redemption through the ordinary faithfulness of ordinary people making ordinary choices in their particular contexts. When we think about what the Book of Ruth has to teach us about community, about how we're meant to live together, several themes emerge. First, there's the importance of social structures that protect the vulnerable, the laws about gleaning, about family redemption, about levirate marriage. These weren't perfect systems, and they could be exploited or ignored, but they represented an attempt to ensure that widows and foreigners and the poor weren't simply left to starve, that there were mechanisms built into society to provide for those who had no other recourse. Boaz follows these laws and goes beyond them, which is the combination that creates flourishing. Systems that establish baseline protections, plus individuals who exceed the minimum requirements and show extraordinary generosity. Second, there's the theme of mutual obligation, the idea that we belong to each other, that family and community create networks of responsibility where the strong have duties toward the weak, where those with resources are expected to share them, where isolation and self-sufficiency aren't ideals but failures. Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, which means he has an obligation to help Naomi and Ruth, and he fulfills that obligation not grudgingly but joyfully, seeing it as privilege rather than burden. This stands in stark contrast to the closer relative who calculates the cost and decides he can't afford to help, who sees redemption as a threat to his own estate rather than an opportunity to bless others and preserve family. Third, there's the importance of seeing people rather than categories. Boaz doesn't just see a Moabite woman, or a gleaner when he looks at Ruth. He sees a person, someone with a story, someone who has made choices that reveal character, someone worthy of respect and honour. If he had only seen her category, her foreignness, her poverty, her gender, he might have done their minimum the law required, and nothing more. But because he actually sees her, asks about her, listens to her story, he responds with compassion and generosity that goes far beyond obligation. And fourth, there's the recognition that seemingly small acts of kindness can have profound consequences. Boaz didn't know when he spoke kindly to a gleaning woman that he was setting in motion events that would lead to David and eventually to Jesus. He was just being decent. But his decency mattered. It changed Ruth's life. It changed Naomi's life. And ultimately, it changed history. We rarely know the full impact of our choices. We can't predict how our kindness or our cruelty will ripple outward. But the Book of Ruth suggests that faithfulness in small things, treating people with dignity, showing mercy, including the outsider, these ordinary actions are the building blocks of redemption, the means by which God's purposes unfold in the world. As we prepare to rest, as we let this story settle into our hearts and minds, perhaps what we most need to hear is that our ordinary lives matter, that the choices we make in our everyday existence, how we treat the people we encounter, whether we show kindness or indifference, whether we extend ourselves or protect our comfort, these choices participate in something larger than themselves. We may not be establishing royal lineages or preparing for the Messiah's coming, but we are creating the texture of human community. We're either building spaces where flourishing is possible or spaces where suffering compounds. We're either embodying Hesed or withholding it. And in these choices, we reveal who we are and whose we are. The Book of Ruth reminds us that redemption often comes through ordinary means, through grain harvests and legal transactions, through acts of kindness and words of commitment, through people showing up for each other day after day, choosing faithfulness when it would be easier to walk away. God doesn't usually show up in burning bushes or parted seas or angelic announcements, at least not in most of our lives. Instead, God shows up in the friend who stays when everyone else leaves, in the stranger who offers help without expecting anything in return, in the unexpected provision that arrives just when we need it, in the new possibilities that emerge from loss when we thought all possibilities were exhausted. And if we're on the receiving end, if we're Ruth or Naomi, desperate and vulnerable and dependent on others' mercy, the book offers hope that our worth isn't determined by our circumstances, that being poor or foreign or widowed doesn't make us less valuable, that there are still people like Boaz who will see us and honour us and make space for us. And beyond that, there is a God who sees and honours and makes space, even when human beings fail to do so. A God under whose wings we can take refuge, whose Hesed is more reliable than any human kindness, even while it often works through human kindness. The ending of the book, with the women of Bethlehem surrounding Naomi and the baby, blessing and celebrating and declaring that Ruth is better than 7 sons. It's such a communal moment, such a picture of what community can be at its best. Rejoicing with those who rejoice, celebrating restoration, honouring faithfulness, welcoming the foreigner who has become family. These women who witnessed Naomi's return in bitterness now witness her joy in fullness. They've been with her through the whole journey, and their presence matters. Their words of blessing matter. Their naming of what has happened matters. We're not meant to face loss or celebrate redemption in isolation. We're meant to do it together, held by community, witnessed by others who can sometimes see hope when we can't, who can name God's faithfulness when we're too close to the pain to recognise it. As you rest tonight, as you let your body relax and your mind quiet, perhaps you can hold the story of Ruth gently. Let it speak to whatever place in your own life needs to hear it. If you're in a season of loss, if you feel empty and bitter like Naomi when she returned to Bethlehem, the The story doesn't promise that everything will be fixed immediately or that the pain will disappear. But it does suggest that your story isn't over, that new chapters can still be written, that faithfulness in small things creates space for redemption to unfold, even if you can't see it yet. The famine ended, the harvest came, Ruth and Boaz found each other, and baby Obed was born. Not because anyone manipulated circumstances to make it happen, but because people kept making faithful choices, kept showing up, kept extending kindness, and in the accumulation of those choices, something new became possible. If you're in a season of uncertainty, if you're like Ruth standing at a crossroads, trying to decide whether to stay or go, whether to commit or protect yourself, whether to risk or play it safe, the story doesn't guarantee that faithfulness will be rewarded in ways you can predict or control. Ruth didn't know how things would turn out when she chose to stay with Naomi, but she knew that loyalty mattered more than security, that some commitments are worth making, even when the outcome is unclear. And perhaps the invitation is to trust that faithfulness itself has value, that choosing to love and commit and show up matters regardless of how things turn out, that we become who we're meant to be through these choices of loyalty and courage, even if we never see the larger purposes they might serve. If you're in a season of relative stability and comfort, if you have resources and standing like Boaz, the story asks what you're doing with what you have. Whether you're using your power and privilege to protect and provide for the vulnerable, or whether you're hoarding it for your own security. Whether you see the Ruths in your community, or whether you're too focused on your own concerns to notice who's gleaning in your fields. Whether you're willing to go beyond what's required, or whether you do the minimum and consider yourself generous. The closer relative who declined to redeem Ruth and Naomi isn't condemned in the text, but he is forgotten. His name isn't even recorded. He disappears from the story because he chose self-protection over generosity. And perhaps that's its own kind of judgment. To have had the opportunity to participate in redemption and to have declined. To be so close to something beautiful and to have walked away because it might cost too much. The Book of Ruth is short. You can read the whole thing in less than 15 minutes, but it contains such depth, such beauty, such wisdom about what it means to be human and to live in community and to trust in a God who works through ordinary faithfulness. It gives us Ruth, strong and loyal and willing to risk everything for love. It gives us Naomi, bitter and honest and gradually opening to hope again. It gives us Boaz, powerful and generous and using his resources to bless rather than dominate. And through these three imperfect human beings trying to do right in difficult circumstances, God writes a story of redemption that leads to David and ultimately to Jesus, that shows us what Hesed looks like in practice, that invites us to participate in the same kind of faithful living that created space for their story to unfold. As you drift towards sleep, you might picture Ruth in the barley fields, the morning sun rising over Bethlehem, her arms full of grain gathered from the edges of the harvest. Grain that will feed her and Naomi for another day, another week. Provision arriving through hard work and kind permission, through law and grace working together. You might picture Boaz at the threshing floor in the middle of the night, waking to find Ruth at his feet, and responding not with anger or lust or confusion, but with blessing and honour and commitment to do right by her. You might picture Naomi holding baby Obed, her arms full again after years of emptiness, her face transformed from bitterness to joy, surrounded by the women of Bethlehem who have walked with her through loss and now celebrate with her in restoration. And you might rest in the knowledge that the same God who worked through Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's kindness and Naomi's persistence, the same God who brings harvest after famine and hope after despair and new life after death, that God is still at work in our world and in our lives, still writing stories of redemption through ordinary people making faithful choices, still creating space for the outsider, still caring for the widow, still showing Hesed to both the living and the dead. The Book of Ruth ends with a genealogy, with names and generations, with the steady march of history that leads from Perez to Boaz to Obed to Jesse, to David. And if we extended it further, it would lead to Jesus, to the one who embodied Hesed perfectly, who came as an outsider to include all outsiders, who suffered and died to bring new life, who demonstrates once and for all that God's heart is for redemption, for restoration, for welcoming home the lost and filling the empty, and giving hope to those who thought hope was gone. Tonight as you rest, you are held by that same Hesed, that same steadfast love that moved through Ruth's story and moves through all of history and moves through your particular life right now. You are not alone in your grief if you're grieving, not alone in your uncertainty if you're uncertain, not alone in your ordinary daily living if that's where you are. The God who enabled Ruth to conceive and brought baby Obed into the world, who guided Ruth to Boaz's field and moved Boaz's heart to kindness, who turned Naomi's emptiness to fullness and her bitterness to blessing. That God is with you now, working through the ordinary circumstances of your life, inviting you into faithfulness, holding you in Hesed, writing your story as part of the larger story of redemption that has been unfolding since the beginning and will continue until all things are made new. The Book of Ruth began with famine and death, with a family fleeing their homeland and losing everything, with bitterness and emptiness and grief. But it ends with harvest and birth, with family reconstituted and legacy preserved, with blessing and fullness and joy. And the movement from beginning to end happened through faithfulness, through loyalty, through kindness, through people showing up for each other day after day, through ordinary human decency becoming the vehicle for divine redemption. Your life has that same potential, those same movements from loss to restoration, from emptiness to fullness, from bitterness to blessing. Not because everything will be fixed, or because pain will be erased, but because faithfulness creates space for new possibilities, because Hesed compounds over time, because ordinary choices to love and commit and show up matter more than we can know. So rest now in the arms of the God whose wings shelter you, whose Hesed sustains you, whose purposes include you, even when you can't see how your life fits into any larger story. Rest knowing that your faithfulness matters, that your kindness matters, that your ordinary daily choices to treat people with dignity and extend mercy and include the outsider. These things participate in redemption, even if you never see the results. Rest knowing that loss doesn't have the final word, that new chapters can open when you thought the book was closed, that babies can be born to fill empty arms and empty hearts, that the house of bread can provide bread again after famine, that morning comes after night, and harvest comes after planting, and hope persists even through the darkest seasons. Let the story of Ruth settle into your bones, into your breath, into your dreams. Let it remind you that you are part of a community, that you belong to others and they belong to you, that isolation isn't the goal, but connection, mutual obligation, the beautiful and difficult work of living together and caring for each other and creating spaces where all can flourish. Let it remind you that God works through the ordinary, through the everyday, through people like you making choices like the ones you make, through faithfulness in small things, through kindness in ordinary moments, through showing up and staying present and extending yourself even when it's hard. The fields are full of grain tonight. The threshing floor is quiet. The baby sleeps in his grandmother's arms, and all of Bethlehem rests in the peace of harvest completed and family restored. Ruth the Moabite has become Ruth the ancestor of kings. The foreigner has become family. The outsider has become essential. And her name is remembered with honour alongside Rachel and Leah, alongside the great women of faith who shaped Israel's story, and through Israel shaped the story of the world. Naomi, who came back empty, has been filled. Boaz, who showed kindness, has received blessing. and the lineage that will lead to David and to Jesus continues through this unlikely family, through this Moabite woman, and this generous landowner, and this bitter widow who found hope again. Rest now in that same hope, that same faithfulness, that same hesed that moved through their lives and moves through yours. Close your eyes and let the story carry you into sleep, into dreams, into the quiet trust that your life matters, that your choices matter, that the God who worked redemption through Ruth and Naomi and Boaz is still working redemption through ordinary people in ordinary places, still bringing harvest after famine, still filling emptiness with fullness, still writing stories of hope in the midst of loss. The Book of Ruth is finished, but its truth continues, rippling through time, reaching across centuries, speaking still to anyone who has known loss or shown loyalty, to anyone who has gleaned in the margins or extended kindness to the stranger, to anyone who has felt bitter or empty or abandoned and wondered if there's any hope left. There is hope, the book whispers. There is still hope. Not hope that erases suffering or makes everything easy, but hope that life continues, that new beginnings emerge from endings, that faithfulness matters, and kindness matters, and ordinary human decency creates space for extraordinary grace. There is hope because God is still at work, still bringing redemption through the everyday choices of everyday people, still caring for the widow and welcoming the foreigner, and establishing justice and mercy in the world. There is hope because you are part of this story, part of this long lineage of faith, part of this ongoing movement toward restoration and wholeness and home. Sleep now. Rest deeply. Let the peace of Bethlehem at harvest time fill your heart. Let the image of baby Obed in Naomi's arms remind you that new life comes even after death, that joy returns even after grief, that your story isn't over, no matter how final things might feel. Let Ruth's courage inspire you. Let Boaz's kindness challenge you. Let Naomi's honest struggle comfort you. And let the God who worked through all of them hold you in hesed tonight and always. The Book of Ruth is a gift, a small, perfect story of love and loss and redemption, and it's yours now to carry, to remember, to let shape how you live and love and show up in the world. May you sleep well, held by the wings of the God who shelters all who seek refuge, surrounded by the love that never fails, at peace in the knowledge that you are known and valued, and part of a story much larger and more beautiful than you can imagine. Amen.